Hello, bookworms! Welcome back to the Bonified Bookworm. I'm your host, Rachel, and if you're here to read along with me and improve your English. So, as I mentioned, I think on the last episode or the episode before, I'm trying to decide what book to read next. So, just for my general reading, and I have selected a book. I'm reading Verity by Colleen Hoover. I'll give a full review on it once I'm done reading that book. She's a very popular writer right now, author right now. She got famous, I think, really kind of through TikTok, through Book Talk. Her book, It Ends With Us, was recommended, and then It Starts With Us as well. People really like those books. There's a movie starring Blake Lively that's going to come out August 9th for It Ends With Us. It's a really good book. I highly recommend that you read the book first before you go see the movie. As far as casting selections, you know, I really don't care that much as long as they can play the character correctly. Although I am disappointed about one character's eye color just because she kind of points that out a few times. So I kind of wonder why they didn't decide to do contacts for that character. But anyway, it's a good book. I hope the movie is as good as the book. It looks like it will be. So I hope to go see that when it's out. And I'll give you a review of that as well. Just a reminder, our next book is Untamed Seas by Deborah Scaling Kiley and Meg Noonan. This is the version that I'm going to read from. There are several different versions out there. If you do want to read along, you'll probably want to get this version just so all the pages line up. But really, I mean, it's up to you if you even read along or if you just want to listen. So, back to Touching the Void with Joe Simpson. So, when we left Joe, he finally reached Simon and Richard, and they got him back to civilization, and they were taking him into surgery. So we know that he survived somehow. So now we are on the postscript, page 201. June 1987, Hunza Valley, Karakoram, Himalayas, Pakistan. I watched the two small figures gradually dwindle into invisibility on the bleak hillside above me. Andy and John were going for the summit of the unclimbed 20,000-foot Tupodem. I was alone again in the mountains, but I had chosen to be. I turned away and tended the little gas stove, heating my second cup of coffee. The movement made my knee ache. I swore irritably and leant forward to massage the pain away. Arthritis. The scars of 6 operations stood out lividly on the distorted joint. At least the wounds in my mind had healed better than these. The doctors had told me I would get arthritis. They had said the whole knee joint would have to be removed within the next 10 years. But then they had said a lot of things, few of which were true. You will never bend the knee again, Mr. Simpson. You will have a permanent limp. You'll never climb again. They were right about the arthritis, though, I thought ruefully as I turned off the stove and glanced anxiously back to the hillside. The first sharp stab of fear for them trembled through me. Come back safe. At least do that, I whispered to the now silent hills. Given fine weather, they should be down in 3 days. I knew it would be a long wait. I felt sad to have dropped out of the summit attempt. The leg had worked so well, but then the pain had started. I knew that to climb here only 10 weeks after the last operation was inviting fresh injury. But I was glad I had tried, and there was always next year. 6 days earlier, we had reached the coal beneath the shoulder of our mountain and dug a snow cave. We had sat outside, gazing silently at the Himalayas stretching away from us. The sun had burnt down from an endless blue sky, and the sea of snow summits was etched sharply in the crystal clear air. This was what I had come to see, pristine, untouchable, lofting into the sky, perfectly beautiful. The sun glittered diamanty? I don't know how to pronounce that word. Reflections off frozen snow crystals. Karen Cove loomed above, only 5 miles distant. I fancied I could see the curve of the earth in the limitless horizon of peaks set before me. I tried to believe I could see Everest despite knowing it was 1,000 miles from here. The names of the ranges rolled through my mind: the Hindu Kush, the Pamirs, Tibet, and the Karakorams. Everest, goddess mother of the snows. Nanda, Devi, K2, Nanga, Parbat, Kanchenjunga. So much history in those names, and of all those who had climbed on them. Suddenly they were real to me, as they never would have been had I chosen not to return. Somewhere out there, somewhere out in those serried peaks lay the bodies of 2 of my friends, alone, buried in the snows on different mountains. That was the dark side of this beauty, which for this moment I could close from my mind. I packed my rucksack, shouldered it, and after one last look towards where they had disappeared, turned away and began the walk back to camp. 10 years on. In his book about another climb in the Andes against the wall, published in 1997, Simon Yates was kind enough to acknowledge that I had told his side of the Sayula Grande story faithfully and truly in Touching the Void, and he ruminated on the questions of conscience that might have remained a decade or so after the event. I am so relieved to hear him say that his conscience is clear, for he did what I would have done in his place, the only sensible course open to him at the end of an heroic attempt to rescue me. He wrote, "Some would argue that there was no decision to be made, that cutting the rope and the powerful symbol of trust and friendship it represents should never have entered my mind. Others say that it was simply a matter of survival, something I was forced to do. As it happened, for a long time, I simply hung on, hoping that Joe would be able to take his weight off the rope and relieve my position. By the time I remembered I had a knife in the top of my rucksack, I was at the end of my tether, unable to hold him for much longer. I knew I had done all that could reasonably be expected of me to save Joe. And now both our lives were being threatened. I had reached a point where I had to look after myself. Although I knew my action might result in his death, I took the decision intuitively in a split second. It simply felt the right thing to do, like so many critical decisions I had taken during the climb. Without hesitation, I removed the knife from the rucksack and cut the rope. Such moments of intuition always seem to feel the same, impersonal, as if the decision had not come from my own mind. Only with hindsight could I see there had been a build-up to that moment. During the days before, we had made many errors of judgment. We had not eaten or drunk enough and carried on climbing long after nightfall. By doing so, we had allowed ourselves to become cold, exhausted, and dehydrated. One evening, I became so cold waiting outside for Joe to finish digging a snow hole that some of my fingers became frostbitten. In short, we had not looked after ourselves. I can see now that Simon is right, though I didn't always view it this way, as a matter of neglect. Analyzing after a climb what you did correctly or incorrectly is as important as being fit or talented. So it was natural that for several years I too mulled over what had happened and tried to work out where we had gone wrong and what vital mistakes we had made. At first, I was convinced we had done nothing wrong. I would still have back-climbed the ice cliff in the way I did, although perhaps with a little more care about the quality of the ice. We would still have climbed alpine style, used snow caves instead of tents, and carried the same equipment and food. It was Simon who eventually pointed out to me where we had made our fatal mistake, and it happened before we left base camp. Gas. We hadn't allowed ourselves enough gas to keep us adequately hydrated. One small canister between the two of us per day was simply insufficient. So, as to save weight, we had pared everything down to the minimum. It left us no room to maneuver when things started to go so drastically wrong. When Simon lowered me to near the Santa Rosa coal, and before we committed ourselves to descending the west face in a gathering storm in imminent darkness, we had considered digging a snow cave and sitting the storm out. If we had done that, we could have made the lowers on a bright and sunny day. We would have seen and avoided the ice cliff and remained in control. Instead, as the storm cloud gathered over the coal, we were painfully aware that we had run out of food and gas the previous night. Already dangerously dehydrated, we couldn't risk the possibility of being trapped by a prolonged storm with no way of producing fluid. I was already suffering the dehydrating and weakening effect of a traumatic fracture of a major bone and the consequent internal bleeding. We had no choice. For the sake of a canister of gas to melt ice and snow for warm drinks, we had to carry on, and so we lost control and nearly our lives. In his book, Simon continues his analysis. All my agonizing after cutting the rope had not changed anything. My decision had been right. We had both survived. In subsequent years, I have overheard numerous heated debates about the ethics of my decision and many what-if scenarios. I have met people who are understanding of my actions and others who are openly hostile. Their second-hand opinion means nothing compared to the words Joe uttered to me in that tent that night in Peru. With the greater mountaineering skills and experience I now possess, I do not believe that I would get into such a situation again. But if somehow I did, I know that my decision would be the same. In just one respect, I feel I was neglectful. In the extreme stress of my predicament, I came to the conclusion without a close inspection that any attempt at rescue in the crevice was impossible. On reflection, I can see that it would probably have done more harm than good to have tried, but it simply did not occur to me to go to the edge and look carefully into the depths. Ultimately, we all have to look after ourselves, whether on mountains or in day-to-day life. In my view, that is not a license to be selfish, for only by taking good care of ourselves are we able to help others. Away from the mountains and the complexity of everyday life, the price of neglecting this responsibility might be a marriage breaking down, a disruptive child, a business failing, or a house repossessed. In the mountains, the penalty for neglect can often be death. Second-hand opinions, as Simon puts it, were never something I'd paid much attention to after the accident. We knew exactly what had happened between us, and we're quite happy with it. I wrote this book in the hope that by telling the story straight, it might nip in the bud any harsh or unfair criticism of Simon. The rope cutting had clearly touched a nerve, transgressed some unwritten rule, and people seemed to be drawn to that element of the story until I wrote it down as honestly as I could. Even so, the misinformed opinions of some armchair adventurers were never going to worry either of us for long. Recovering from my injuries and getting back to the mountains were my priorities, not vague speculation by others on what we should or should not have done. 90% of accidents are down to human error. We are fallible, and accidents will happen. I suppose the trick is to anticipate all the possible consequences of what you set out to do, so that if things do go wrong, you are better able to stay in control. I can add only that however painful readers may think our experiences were, for me, this book still falls short of articulating just how dreadful were some of those lonely days. I simply could not find the words to express the utter desolation of the experience. Joe Simpson, August 1997. Epilogue. Bad Memories. In mid-July 2002, I stood at the precise point where 17 years earlier Simon Yates had found me on a dark, snow-filled night in the Peruvian Andes. At that time, I had been an emotionally and physically shattered wreck of a human being. I weighed a little under 90 pounds and was suffering from ketoacidosis and was close to falling into a coma. My body was as near to total exhaustion as it is possible to get without dying. I suspect now, having spoken to a number of doctors, that I probably was dying when Simon found me that night. Now, all these years later, I was uncomfortably aware of the cameraman, the director, and the sound man watching expectantly as they pointed a lens and a long, furry microphone at me. Simon was standing by my side, explaining to the camera what it had been like to find me, the state I was in, and the way I was lying on the rocks. I seemed to be hearing all this from a distance. I could feel that my heart rate was increasing rapidly, and I was acutely conscious of the surrounding mountains. They seemed to press in on me. I felt out of breath. A hot flush ran through me, and I started sweating copiously. I shifted uncomfortably, hoping the camera was not picking up on these signs. I was feeling strangely vulnerable, as if about to be attacked. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more worried I became. I was asked a question, and I seemed to be hearing it from a long way away. I could hear the blood pumping in my temples. As I started speaking, I was trying furiously not to cry. I had been determined not to give a teary interview, and yet now I was being ambushed. I heard myself talking about the moment Simon and Richard came looking for me in the dark. The sight of their head torches and that exquisite moment when I realized the nightmare was over and that the rest of my life had just been given back to me. I looked down at the ground where I had been found lying face down on the rocks, and then glanced up the riverbed of chaotic jumbled boulders. How on earth did I get down that in the dark? The thought seemed to make the feeling of panic stronger. I'm not even sure whether I stopped talking, but for a long moment, as I looked at the ground, I had the feeling of lying there, the uncanny sensation of Simon's hands gripping me by the shoulders and rolling me over and holding me. I almost turned around to see who had touched my shoulders. It was as if something hallucinogenic had happened to my brain. My brain synapses had crossed, colors, feelings, and sensation from some long, deep, hidden memory had come bursting back with quite shocking force. Perhaps it lasted a millisecond. It seemed like minutes. Then the moment was gone, and I was left feeling completely unnerved. Simon and I walked back towards where the film crew had reconstructed our original base camp. It looked very familiar. I think Simon must have noticed something. He asked if I was okay. I said, no, not really, and not much more. I wanted to run away. I sat down and tried to calm myself. Externally, I appeared quite normal. Inside, I was feeling hysterical. Back in the huge base camp, 20 minutes walk down the valley, I began to feel a little better. I went to my tent, poured a shot of whiskey into a tin mug, lit a cigarette, and thought, Joe, that was a panic attack. Don't worry, it's normal. In truth, I don't know what it was, but it was to happen repeatedly over the next 3 weeks, perhaps not so strongly, but that may have been because I was bracing myself for the attacks. Telling myself as they came on that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, and that it would fade helped. As we had made the slow 4-day walk into the camp with a 14-strong group comprising the film crew, the safety team, porters, and 76 donkeys, I hadn't the slightest anxiety about being back in that familiar landscape. In fact, it seemed farcical, dressing up in 80s style gear and reenacting the approach with I know this word, it's hard for me to say, reckless front donkeys and the team doctor disguised as Richard Hawking was a combination of hilarious farce and tedious repetition. We tramped past the camera tripod, then scurried around, herding the confused burros back the way they'd come so we would do yet another take. Start walking for camera when you get to the large patch of lupins, the cryptic instructions squawked from the radio, and we glanced at the distant notch on the ridge where the camera with the big 600mm lens fitted was set up. We then examined the steeply angled walls of the V-shaped valley which we are about to traverse. The slopes ran thousands of feet down from a jagged, rocky ridgeline to the thin, glinting, sinuous lines of a river far below us. The entire hillside was covered in lupins. When I sighted the snow-covered peaks as we rounded the valley far above the village of Hayupa, I registered only pleasant surprise to see old friends again. The ice-sheathed peaks of Rasak and Europa dominated the head of the valley. My reaction was one of interest rather than foreboding. I had forgotten how beautiful these mountains were and realized with a start that despite 20 years of climbing mountains all over the world, the Cordillera Hayuash was still the most beautiful mountain range I have ever laid my eyes upon. It made me smile. Then I saw the west face of Sayula Grande and felt a tremor of fear. It was bigger and meaner, and so much more threatening than I remembered. It made me wonder at the person I had been all those years ago. I must have been bold, ambitious, or even a little crazy to have considered such an undertaking. I traced the line of our ascent and watched the snow pluming off the north ridge and the strong high-altitude winds. It scared me. Where had all that drive and passion gone? How had I lost that sense of invincibility, the confidence born of youth, too much testosterone and too little imagination? As I turned from the face and trudged up the jumbled moraine fields on the glacier, I consoled myself with the thought that at least I was here, a little grayer around the temples, only a little wiser, but at least I was here. The days spent reenacting for the camera, the crawling on the glacier, and the moraines were both surreal and disturbing. I knew everything was being filmed so that my face could not be recognized when they cut the film in with action reconstructions filmed with actors in the Alps. Nevertheless, it felt irritating to have to go through the unnerving business of dressing up in the same mountaineering clothing, wrapping the yellow foam mat around my right leg, and then pretending to crawl and fall and hop as I had done 17 years earlier. Why couldn't they have just used an actor out here? I kept asking myself. I felt as I was about to be attacked from behind at any moment. The feelings became more powerful when I was on the moraines or the glacier, and the familiar cirque of mountain ridges dominated my every view. It was a memory that had been seared into my consciousness. Seeing it again all these years later was the trigger that brought back my worst memories and associations. This was the place where I had known I was going to die. Those ridgelines should have been the last thing I would ever see. I should never have come back. It was not cathartic. It was terrifying. Oddly enough, Simon and I hardly spoke to each other about our personal feelings. So much had been written and spoken about the experience as if there was no more to be said, and therefore no point speaking about it. Nothing would change. In our hearts, we knew better than anyone what had happened in this place. It was history, and we had dealt with it. For me, the memories came rushing back with such a clarity and startling vividness that I became convinced at times that the last 17 years had not passed by, and I was back in the terrible reality of 1985, trying to crawl down the mountain. One day, I was alone in a narrow, sandy gulch, running between the moraines and the valley walls. I was staring at the miles of jumbled rocks, with my leg strapped in the clothes and rucksacks donned, waiting for the radio call from the film crew, perched on a high ridge over a mile away. Again, I began to panic. In 1985, I had sat in this precise spot, convinced that Simon and Richard were following along behind me. That had been a hallucination, a cocoon of comfort I had hidden in so well that I had believed it completely. It was no weirder than the one that I now seem to be experiencing 17 years later. I kept peering nervously over my shoulder, trying to make out the people on the ridge. My heart began racing and I kept sucking in deep, nervous breaths. I thought I might burst into tears. Then I spotted the tiny figures huddled around the camera and tried to calm myself. The sense of menace increased when I heard the rattle of rocks tumbling down the valley walls and spurts of dust drifted away on the wind. They were uncomfortably close. I glanced back at the ridge. Come on, I want to get out of here. Another volley of rocks spat down towards me. I jerked away instinctively. Seconds later, a feeling of all-consuming panic overwhelmed me. I had to run from the place. I had to escape. Just as I began to remove the mat strapped to my leg, the radio squawked into life. "Joe, this is Kevin. Do you copy?" I stared at the radio aerial poking from my chest pocket. Joe, do you copy? Are you ready for the take?" "Kevin, this is Joe. I copy." I released the transmit button and let out a long sigh of relief. "Okay, Joe, begin to crawl towards the Rocky Narrows, please, in your own time." I began to laugh. It had a slightly manic edge. I was not enjoying my return to Peru. Traumatic emotions, feelings of guilt, regret, sadness, and terror travel hardwired neural pathways in a manner that mimics ingrained or archetypal fears. There have been huge advances into the shadows of memory and deep-seated fear. Today, scientists are discovering ways to help the brain unlearn fears and inhibitions. Tests on mice and rats have shown that the brain's hormonal reactions to such memories can be inhibited, thereby softening the emotions that they evoke. In short, they are mastering the means of short-circuiting the very wiring of primal fear in the mind. The source of your worst nightmares, real or imagined terrors, radiates from a dense knot of neurons called the amygdala. That's not right. With each new traumatic experience or the reliving of an old one, this fear center triggers a release of hormones that sear horrifying impressions on your brain. The unbearable becomes unforgettable. I lost my place. The unbearable becomes unforgettable. The research is aimed at helping victims fend off the ravages of post-traumatic stress disorder. The first human trials with beta blocker propanol have already taken place in America. For the medicine to be effective, patients have to take them soon after the event. The patients have to take them as soon after the event as possible. I'd always been a little skeptical about the very idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. It seems that everyone gets it nowadays, and I was suspicious that it had become a catch-all to provide explanation from the past and a convenient way of suing for compensation. Why were not millions of people paralyzed by post-traumatic stress disorders after the First and Second World Wars? Both soldiers and civilians alike who bore witness to the most appalling experiences imaginable on a scale never before encountered. Certainly by the Second World War, shell shock had been recognized as something other than lacking moral fiber. Perhaps the difference then was that people did not live in the ghastly blame and compensation culture that we do today. So it came as some surprise to be told on my return from Peru that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. In all likelihood, the memory of the mountains surrounding the moraines and glacier had been so powerfully ingrained that it brought the fears of 1985 back to me with quite startling lucidity. It was as if it had happened a few days before. I was told that the effect would soon wear off since I seemed to have dealt so effectively with the traumas of Sayula Grande in the intervening 17 years. I was put on a waiting list for an appointment with a psychotherapist, which was something that I was deeply uncomfortable about. I had always felt a certain disdain, bordering on contempt, for the particularly American reliance on therapy and counseling. The very British stiff upper lip approach to such matters seemed the most effective and most dignified remedy. However, I had to admit to feeling pretty strange on my return, so I reluctantly agreed to the appointment. In the meantime, I experienced 8 weeks of mild panic attacks, a tendency to cry unexpectedly, and a persistent feeling of vulnerability. Then I gave a corporate motivational presentation recounting the void story, and within days the symptoms had disappeared. It took 6 months before someone rang me about a possible appointment. I declined the offer with a few choice words about the parlous state of the health service and felt relieved that I hadn't been suffering from a serious mental illness. Telling and retelling the void story had inadvertently proved to be a good treatment for my condition. Apparently, it is common practice for psychotherapists to make a victim recount as vividly as they can the full horrors of their experience. With each telling of their real story, it gradually becomes a fiction, becomes someone else's experience, and they can separate themselves from the trauma. In short, the hardwired neural pathways to the amygdala, the fear center, are blocked or, at very least, bypassed. When I went to see one of the first screenings of the drama documentary at a theater in Soho, I was filled with mixed emotions. I was relieved that it was all over and something had at last been made for more than 10 years of negotiating movie deals for the rights of the book. At one point, it had been sold to a combined production company involving Sally Field and Tom Cruise. It was meant to be a star vehicle for Tom Cruise, which caused general hilarity in the climbing world and many jokes about Nicole Kidman playing the part of Simon. I knew at the time that if the film were ever made, it would be the usual tripe that the Hollywood studios serve up each year. They were, however, paying an awful lot of money to make tripe. When the deal fell through and the rights reverted to me, I was pleased to hear that a respected drama documentary company, Darlow Smithson, were interested in the rights. With Kevin MacDonald, an Oscar award-winning drama documentary director, on board, I had hopes that maybe a respectable film of the book might be made. By the time I entered the theater, I had no idea what it was going to be like. Apart from my own personal difficulties in Peru, the whole business of filmmaking had proved to be both staggeringly tedious and utterly confusing. I was painfully aware of how easy it would be to make a complete mess filming the book. 1 hour and 40 minutes later, I sat in my seat as the credits rolled, feeling pleased and anxious. The film was remarkably faithful to the book, and although I am the last person to judge it, I felt it was a powerful and emotional production. I was anxious because I had not realized how exposed Simon and I would be until I saw the way we narrated the entire story to the camera. Neither of us had ever sought that sort of public exposure, and it made for uncomfortable viewing. If hearing a recording of your own voice feels odd, seeing yourself on a big screen is downright disturbing. It is always difficult to make a satisfactory film of a popular book, but in this case, they seem to have succeeded. That, however, is for readers and viewers to judge. The real experience, of which I have been so powerfully reminded, would always distance Simon and me from any written or celluloid representation. Oddly enough, the physical and emotional trauma experienced in Peru in 1985 did not change my life. It was the success of touching the void and my future writing and speaking career that materially changed me. The making of the film will no doubt bring further changes and challenges. I often wonder what would have happened to my life if we had not had the accident in Celula Grande. A part of me thinks that I would have gone on to climb harder and harder routes, taking greater risks each time. Given the toll of friends over the years, I'm not confident that I would be alive today. In those days, I was a penniless, narrow-minded, anarchic, abrasive, and ambitious mountaineer. The accident opened up a whole new world for me. Without it, I would never have discovered hidden talents for writing and public speaking. Despite having worked hard, I do sometimes wonder whether I just got lucky. In Peru, we had gone to unusual lengths to take the ultimate risk, and yet despite all the pain and trauma, it now seems a small price to pay for such an inspiring adventure. Isn't memory a wonderful deceiver? Almost losing everything in Peru was a sensation quite as life-enhancing as winning. I seem to have been on a worryingly long winning streak ever since. Where will it all end? It is a hot, sunny day in Sheffield as I struggle to write my 7th book, a novel. I'm trying not to be distracted by a forthcoming fly fishing holiday in Ireland, followed by a 4th attempt on the north face of the Eiger. A busy autumn of speaking engagements and publicity for the release of the film beckons. Fighting for my life on Sayula Grande 17 years ago seems to have turned me into a successful businessman, which is very odd. Life can deal you an amazing hand. Do you play it steady, bluff like crazy, or go all in? I'll never know. Joe Simpson, July 2003. And that is the end of Touching the Void. So, I really enjoyed this book, especially the end. Like, I really liked hearing his thoughts and how this experience changed him, and just the overall, like, how, you know, you can't help but question, what if? I really enjoyed hearing his thoughts on this. So I might have to go find some of his other books just to see what those are like, if they're climbing books, or is he giving direction on public speaking and things like that, because I am not a good public speaker. I can talk to this little camera because I can pretend nobody really pays attention to what I say. So yeah, I enjoyed it. Leave your comments and thoughts below, and you know, something I was thinking about is maybe doing some type of a live event where we could talk about the book that we finish. If that's something that y'all would like to do, then let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe and share as always. And next time we see each other, or you see me, we will pick up Untamed Seas, like I mentioned. And I hope y'all enjoyed this book. Like I said, let me know your thoughts, and we'll move forward with this one. Hope y'all have a great day, week, month, yeah, wherever you are. Hope it's great. See you next time. Bye.